morning, students. My name is Dr. Khushbu Shah, and I'm Assistant Professor in Department of Pathology. First of all, about the layout of this PowerPoint presentation, we really missed this shaking hands together, right? And I guess as the situation is not allowing us to do so, it is the prime reason why we are here in between this series of e-lectures, right? Okay, so let's begin with today's topic, that is practical approach with diabetes mellitus. And first of all, let's see some basic details about this disease. So what is the definition of diabetes mellitus? So it is a group of metabolic disorder. In PSM, you will also learn that it is also termed as non-communicable disease, which is characterized by hyperglycemia, that is increased blood glucose level, which is resulting from defects in insulin secretion, insulin action, or both. So accordingly, we will be dividing this disease into two main categories, that is type 1 and type 2. In type 1 diabetes mellitus, there will be defect in the secretion of insulin from the beta cell of islets in pancreas, and in type 2, insulin will be there, but the receptors on different tissues will be resistant to the same. So there will be no after effect of this hormone, or either there will be both deficiency of secretion as well as deficient action. And a special category, that is diabetes which occurs in pregnancy, we all know that is termed as gestational diabetes. Okay, so here we are completing definition of this disease, and I think it is very important for viva purpose. Okay, so let's go in detail about some of the physiology. What is the action of this insulin? First of all, it is termed as anabolic hormone. Henceforth, its deficient state, which is the disease, will be termed as catabolic state, in which the patient will be presenting with the symptoms of catabolic states, right? Okay, so what is the action of insulin? It enhances glucose uptake in tissues such as skeletal muscle and adipose tissue. It will increase glycogenesis in liver. It will enhance fatty acid and triglyceride synthesis in adipose tissue and protein synthesis in liver. So basically this is all anabolic action, so it is an anabolic hormone, and its prime action is to clear out glucose from the circulation and divert it to the different tissues, right? So it will decrease gluconeogenesis in liver, which is formation of the glucose from other than the carbohydrate source, which is fat and protein. And it will also decrease glycogenolysis and lipolysis. In turn, the ketogenesis will be less, because we all know that ketone body is produced from the free fatty acid, okay, which will be produced from lipolysis reaction. Okay, so these are some of the physiological action of insulin hormone, and in this disease where the insulin or its action is deficient, all the return will be happening, right? Okay, so this is an overview about the pathophysiology of diabetes. We all know that, as we discussed earlier, there will be insulin which will be insufficient either quantitatively or qualitatively. So there will be reduced tissue uptake of glucose. Clearance of glucose from circulation will not happen. Henceforth, there will be intracellular hypoglycemia or extracellular hyperglycemia. Firstly, let's look in detail about intracellular hypoglycemia. As there is decreased glucose in tissue, negative feedback mechanism will come into action, and it will cause glycogenesis and gluconeogenesis, right? And in turn, for gluconeogenesis, there will be breakdown of fatty acids, which will result in higher level of ketones, and ultimately the metabolic complication stage which will occur is known as diabetic ketoacidosis, right? Other than this, there will be breakdown of protein will be occurring in association with breakdown of fat. So catabolic state will be there, and decreased protein synthesis will be there, which will result as cachexia, lethargy, and polyphagia. Along with that, as we all know that gamma globulin, which is an important part of immunity, will also be reduced. So there will be increased susceptibility to different kind of infections in these patients. In turn, deficient wound healing and repetitive infection in patients with diabetes mellitus. Okay, so let's see in detail about the extracellular hyperglycemia. As there is increased glucose concentration in blood, it will enhance the osmolarity of plasma, and there will be osmotic redistribution of fluid, which will cause dehydration of cell because of the movement of fluid from intracellular to extracellular level, and there will be hyperglycemic coma. In addition to this, if the blood glucose level exceeds the renal threshold level, there will be secretion of glucose into urine, which is known as glycosuria, and it will stimulate chain of reactions, which is polyuria, will also stimulate the thrust center in brain, will cause polydipsia, and because of this there will be electrolyte imbalance in the body, which will cause hypokalemia and hyponatremia, which can be life-threatening. Okay, so now let's come to our prime topic for today, that is the role of laboratory investigations in diagnosis of this disease. We are primarily dividing it into 5 different facets. First one is role in the screening of disease. Second is role in the diagnosis of disease. Third is role for the assessment of glycemic control. Fourth one is role of laboratory test in assessment of long-term risk. And the fifth one is in the management of acute metabolic complication. Now let's learn this all in depth one by one. Okay, starting with the role of laboratory test for screening of diabetes mellitus. So basically we need to screen patients of type 2 diabetes more in comparison to type 1 diabetes. What is the reason for the same? In type 1 diabetes, the presentation will be acute. So the patient will be coming to you by his own, and in type 2 diabetes, the course of the disease is quite insidious and gradual. So it is highly likely that if you do not screen this patient, it will go unknown about the disease. The patient will not at all know that he is having diabetes mellitus, and when he or she will be presenting to you, he will be presenting with irreversible kind of progression of disease where you may not intervene, right? So the type 2 diabetes is the most common type of diabetes mellitus, we all know that, and it is usually asymptomatic in the initial stage. That's why we need to screen the patients of type 2 diabetes more commonly. Okay, so what are the criteria? If in screening test, the blood glucose level is more than 126 mg per dl, it should be repeated on a subsequent day for confirmation of the diagnosis. Okay, first let's focus on the criteria. If the blood glucose level is more than 126 mg per dl, we should confirm it with PP2BS, that is 2-hour postprandial glucose level, and OGTT, that is oral glucose tolerance test. And if this value is more than 200 mg per dl, that is indicative of diabetes mellitus. But if we are getting this kind of results in a patient which is not at all having any symptoms in a screening criteria, we cannot label this patient on the first result, right? So we need to confirm the entire result on the subsequent day, and if the results are same, we will diagnose the patient as diabetic one, right? Because the results can be due to technical error or some other substance in the body or blood present, which may influence the blood glucose level. Sorry. Okay. Now, do we need to screen patients of type 1 diabetes mellitus? I guess the answer is no. Type 1 diabetes is detected early after its onset, since it has an acute presentation, as we discussed earlier, with characteristic clinical features. So it is less likely that we will miss this kind of patient. Therefore, it is not necessary to screen for type 1 diabetes by estimation of blood glucose. So the first method we learn about screening is estimation of blood glucose, and the second one now we are going through is urine glucose test. We'll be detecting urine glucose by Benedict's test, which is also known as the basic sugar test. This is a biochemical test to detect reducing sugars in a solution, and the principle involved here is reduction of copper. Henceforth, it is also known as copper reduction test. All monosaccharides are reducing sugars, and they have free reactive carbonyl group, which will act for the reduction of copper. And some disaccharides have exposed carbonyl group, and they are also reducing sugar. So all these monosaccharides as well as disaccharides will be positive with this Benedict's test, right? Okay. So now here we are covering the first part, that is laboratory investigations for screening of diabetes mellitus. Now we are moving forward to the role of different laboratory tests for the diagnosis of diabetes mellitus. So it is based exclusively on demonstration of raised blood glucose level. The tests used for laboratory diagnosis of diabetes mellitus are firstly estimation of blood glucose and secondly oral glucose tolerance. Glucose concentration can be estimated in whole blood, that can be either capillary or venous blood, as well as in plasma or serum. However, the values may slightly differ according to their native values. Okay, so we are looking at the American Diabetes Association 2004 criteria for diagnosing patients of diabetes mellitus. Sorry for this typographical error. So what are these criteria saying? If FBS, that is fasting blood sugar, is more than 126 mg per dl, PP2PS and RBS, that is 2-hour postprandial and random blood sugar level more than or equal to 200 mg per dl, and HbA1c, that is glycated hemoglobin, is more than 7%, will stamp the patient as diabetic patient, right? And here also we need to repeat the test on subsequent day before stamping the patient, right? Okay, so now this was the criteria. Now let's see about collection and the procedure of this test. So for collection, when whole blood is left at room temperature after collection for few hours or some duration, what will occur? Glycolysis will occur, which will reduce glucose level at the rate of about 7 mg per dl per hour. Glycolysis is further increased in the presence of bacterial contamination or leukocytosis. So what is the value of adding something, some kind of preservative that will reduce glycolysis is that if we'll not add that and glycolysis will occur because of any of this factor, we will have the fallacious result which may mislead us for the diagnosis, right? So it is very important to have the vacuity containing the proper anticoagulant while we are taking blood and while we are drawing blood for the investigation about diabetes mellitus. Right? So which is the anticoagulant used here? It is addition of sodium fluoride, that is 2.5 mg per ml of blood, maintains stable glucose level by inhibiting glycolysis. So sodium fluoride is commonly used along with other anticoagulants such as potassium oxalate or ADTM. Till here it is clear about collection. Now let's go to method of estimation of blood glucose. There are primarily two methods, chemical method and enzymatic method, but most of the time nowadays we are preferring enzymatic method because they are more specific in comparison to chemical method. And if we are talking about pros of chemical methods, yes, they are inexpensive, but the results are less reliable, right? So in all the laboratories today we are using enzymatic method, and here in a New Civil Hospital Surat also we are using GOD-POD method, that is glucose oxidase peroxidase method. So some theoretical knowledge about which are the chemical methods, that is orthotoluidine method, blood glucose reduction method using ferricyanide or copper, and some enzymatic methods are GOD-POD method, hexokinase method, and glucose dehydrogenase method. Okay. Now let's go in detail about this thing that we already talked about, FBS, PP2BS and RBS. Which sample will be known as FBS? The sample for blood glucose is withdrawn after an overnight fasting, that is no calorie intake taken for at least 8 hours, is considered as fasting sample. What about PP2BS? That is blood sample for glucose estimation if collected 2 hours after the subject has taken a normal meal. That is PP2BS. And what is RBS? It is blood sample which is collected at any time of the day irrespective of last food intake. That is RBS. Okay, clear till here? So we have learned the criteria to stamp the patient as diabetic, the diagnostic criteria for diabetes, but there is also this one another term that is known as pre-diabetic. Generally speaking, it is something in between normal and diabetes, normal and disease, which is termed as pre-diabetic. And to define this category, some other blood levels of glucose are determined. For that, FBS should be 100 to 125 mg per dl. PP2BS will be between 140 or 199 milligram per DL, and the value of HbA1c will be more than 5.7 but less than 6.5. Okay. Okay. Till here we are covering estimation of blood glucose. Now let's move forward to oral glucose tolerance test. That is also known as OGTT. So glucose tolerance refers to the ability of the body to metabolize glucose. In diabetes mellitus, this ability is impaired or lost, of course due to deficient insulin. So American Diabetes Association does not recommend OGTT for routine diagnosis of type 1 or type 2 diabetes. The only role of OGTT, only defined role of OGTT is in pregnancy, where the woman is having gestational diabetes mellitus, or if the patient is very suspicious and in screening his or her values are coming below the required level, then we will be performing OGTT, right? Okay, so how do we prepare the patient for OGTT? Here are some requirements. First, patient should be put on carbohydrate-rich, unrestricted diet for 3 days. This is because carbohydrate-restricted diet reduces glucose tolerance because of the hypersensitivity of receptors. Second, patient should be ambulatory with normal physical activity. Absolute bed rest for a few days impairs glucose tolerance. Medication should be discontinued on the day of testing. Exercise, smoking and tea or coffee are not allowed during the test period. Patient should remain seated, and OGTT is carried out in the morning after the patient has fasted overnight or for 8 to 14 hours. Which two samples are collected? So first of all, a fasting venous blood sample is collected in the morning after fast of overnight or 8 to 14 hours. Then patient ingests 75 gram of anhydrous glucose in 250 to 300 ml of water over 5-minute duration. Time of starting glucose drink is taken as 0 hour. What we are doing now is single venous blood sample is collected 2 hours after the glucose load. Previously, there was a method where multiple samples were taken after glucose injection at 0 hour, half hour, 1 hour, 1.5 hour and 2 hour, but this method is no longer recommended now. Then, plasma glucose is estimated in fasting and 2-hour venous blood sample. Okay, so this was all about diagnostic test in which we covered two things, blood glucose estimation and OGTT. Now the patient has come to our OP, we went to community, we screened the patients, results were suspicious, we bring this patient to hospital and perform test for his diagnosis. He is now stamped as diagnosis, he is put on either insulin or anti-diabetic medication, and now which test we will be performing during his follow-ups to assess his glycemic control. Okay, so let's talk about this. Following methods can monitor degree of glycemic control. Here we are dividing it into two different things. First is test to measure immediate control and test for measurement of long-term control. For immediate control, daily self-assessment of the blood glucose is needed, and for long-term control, periodic measurement of glycated hemoglobin, that is HbA1c, is recommended. Now let's go in detail about glycated hemoglobin. So it refers to hemoglobin to which glucose is attached. These are very important two words, non-enzymatically and irreversibly, because its amount depends upon blood glucose level and lifespan of RBC. So it is very essential that we are measuring glycated hemoglobin, which is reflecting the amount of glucose which is attached to RBCs non-enzymatically and irreversibly. There is no chances that the hemoglobin and the glucose might have detached in between and the values are not trustworthy, right? Okay, so level of glycated hemoglobin is proportional to the average glucose level over preceding 6 to 8 weeks in proportion with the lifespan of RBC, that is 120 days, right? Okay, so normally less than 5% of HB is glycated. In diabetes mellitus, it is recommended to maintain glycated HB level to less than 7%. In diabetes mellitus, if glycated hemoglobin is less than 7%, it should be measured every 6 monthly. And if the value is more than 8%, more close follow-ups are recommended, that is every 3 monthly, along with of course change in treatment. There are various methods for measurement of glycated hemoglobin such as chromatography, immunoassay and agar-gel electrophoresis. So even when we perform HPLC by chromatography, we can measure HbA1c. Okay, and this for measurement of immediate control, we can do self-monitoring of blood glucose. Of course, that is very prevalent and common in communities by glucometer. We have seen myriads of our relatives using this device to check for day-to-day control of glucose, right? Okay, so the third portion is also covered. Now let's move towards laboratory tests to assess long-term risk. Okay, so let's first talk about what are these long-term risks. So we all know that long-term complications of diabetes are mainly microvascular and macrovascular complications, which can be further subdivided as diabetic nephropathy, retinopathy, diabetic neuropathy, cardiopathy, peripheral vascular disease and so on. So which are the indicators? If we measure them in laboratory, will give us signals that this particular system is getting affected by this disease and we immediately need to intervene here. Okay, so first of all, to look at and to screen for diabetic nephropathy, we need to assess urinary albumin excretion. And there are mainly these two terms. The first one is microalbuminuria and second one is macroalbuminuria. In microalbuminuria, the level of albumin in urine, level of albumin secreted in urine is more than it should be, but it is less than that is detected by dipstick method. Okay, so it is in between somewhere, that is 30 to 300 milligram per 24 hours. But the positive point about this is that it is the first reaction that occurs in the beginning of diabetic nephropathy. So if we diagnose it and intervene it, still the disease here is reversible. But once macroalbuminuria sets in, it is highly likely that the disease has progressed to irreversible stage. Right. Okay, so which are the tests to screen for microalbuminuria? Firstly, we can do albumin to creatinine ratio in the random urine sample or urinary albumin excretion measurement in 24-hour urine sample. Second, to screen the patient for macrovascular complications related to cardiovascular disease, we need to do lipid profile during follow-ups of the patient and measure HDL, LDL, VLDL, total cholesterol and triglyceride level. The ratio of this would also be recommended. Here we all know that HDL is a good cholesterol and LDL and others are bad cholesterol. So the results should be maintained accordingly. The usual pattern of lipid abnormalities in type 2 diabetes is elevated triglyceride, decreased HDL, which is of course a good cholesterol, and higher proportion of small dense LDL particles. So here we complete our test regarding long-term risk. Now let's move forward to laboratory test in regard to management of acute metabolic complication, and this is the last part. I'm really sorry for this difficult layout. Okay, so firstly let's discuss which can be the complication of diabetes mellitus. There are primarily three complications of diabetes mellitus. First one is diabetic ketoacidosis, three acute complications. The first one is diabetic ketoacidosis. This is most commonly observed in patients of type 1 diabetes. The second one is hyperglycemic hyperosmolar coma, which is more common in patients of type 2 diabetes. And third one, that is hypoglycemia, which is in general the most common complication, acute complication. Right. So to assess this complication, we need to investigate patients with following tests: blood and urine glucose, blood and urine ketone bodies, ABGA, that is arterial blood gas analysis, in which we can determine from the value of pH whether the patient is in metabolic acidosis or alkalosis, that may indicate the state of diabetes ketoacidosis. Serum electrolyte level, so that the treatment can be modified accordingly. Blood osmolarity, serum create and blood urea. Okay. Hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state is characterized by very high blood glucose level, that is more than 600 milligram per dl, along with hyperosmolarity, which will be more than 320 milliosmolar per kg of water. Okay, so here we discussed that we need to measure ketone bodies to get to know this complication if they are happening. So first, which are the tests to detect ketone bodies? This is very important for especially practical point of view. So ketone bodies are formed from metabolism of free fatty acids, and it includes mainly three types of ketone bodies: acetone, acetoacetic acid, and beta hydroxybutyric acid. This is supra viva question, right? Okay. An increased amount of ketone bodies in patients with diabetes mellitus indicate impending or already established diabetic ketoacidosis, and it is a medical emergency. Method based on colorimetric reaction. So here the principle for the test for the detection of ketone bodies in blood or urea is colorimetry reaction between ketone bodies and nitroprusside. Test for urine ketones alone should not be used for diagnosis and monitoring of diabetic ketoacidosis. So it should be used in combination with the other test. It is recommended to measure beta hydroxy. Now this is very important, that in patients with DKA, that is diabetic ketoacidosis, the maximum amount of the ketone body that will be raised is beta hydroxybutyric acid. But unfortunately, majority of our lab tests detect other two ketone bodies than beta hydroxybutyric acid. So we need to specifically perform the measurement of this type of ketone bodies. Okay, so these are two tests that are primarily performed for detection of ketone bodies. The first one is the Rothras nitroprusside method, which detects acetone and acetoacetic acid, and the second one is ferric chloride test, which only detects acetoacetic acid. Okay, so we have covered this entire subject. I hope you have grasped the entire detail, and let me know in comments if you have any query. Thank you.